the center opposition arose, they figured a way to expand the definition of treason to deal with this. And the Founding Fathers were concerned about that. They didn't want that English definition somehow to be applied. So they came up with their own definition. It's quite a bit different from the English definition. Congress, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the President, all of those were defined in terms of their composition or their powers. Why? Well, the President never existed before. There was no President in colonial American law. There was a Congress under the Articles of Confederation, but it was quite different from the Congress that the Constitution created in terms of its powers, in terms of how the representatives were chosen, and the fact that it was made up of two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. So they had to define that Congress to make it clear that it was different from this other Congress. And so you see examples of that kind of terminological specificity. But the militia was not defined. Well, why was that? Because they didn't need to define it. There probably was not a single adult, male or female, of sound mind in the colonies in the late 1700s that did not know exactly what that term meant. Because there had been literally hundreds of statutes passed from the early 1600s through the ratification of the Constitution, even thereafter, in each of the colonies, later to become states after the Declaration of Independence, that specified exactly how the militia in each colony was to be organized and structured and operated. And what's fascinating, if you go back and read all of that statutory material, which I think I've read all of it, it's sometimes hard to find every last little bit of it, but I've dug it all out as much as I could. The fascinating part to me was to see how uniform it was in every colony throughout that entire period. By the late 1600s, they had hit upon a formula, and that formula was simply applied over and over again in every colony. They kept passing these laws every few years. And it was the one then that was adopted by the Constitution, because if you want to know what that word means, you have to look at prior facts and law, because that's really a legal term, militia. It refers to a specific institution. And it's spelled out in these statutes. Now, these statutes organized, at that time, the adult free male population. Remember, they had women. But the women were not legally emancipated. They were subject to their husbands, or they were subject to their fathers, unless they happened to be widows. And they fell in a slightly different category. But they were legally emancipated, and the social mores of the time did not accept the idea that women would be engaged in quasi-military activity bearing arms. So they excluded all the women, essentially. Although there were some statutes, most of the statutes provided for financial duties women might have to undertake. I'll get to that in just a moment. And then, of course, they had slaves. And as everyone who understood the slave system knew, having a slave system was incompatible with arming the slaves for an obvious reason. So the slaves were all excluded from this system, except under some very narrow conditions. So if you looked at the militia statutes of all the colonies, the only real difference that you would see, and it wasn't so much a difference as an addition, in the heavily populated slave states with large populations from Virginia, Carolinas, and Georgia, the militia statutes had provisions for what they called patrols. And the militia were required to function essentially as a slavery police. Go around and make sure the slaves were still on the plantations at night, make sure they weren't wandering off to tippling houses where alcohol might be served and rebellion plotted. Right? So the militia performed this specific function. But if you took those parts of those statutes away, cut them off, and you laid all these statutes side by side at a table in any one particular year, it's pretty hard without having done some other study to know which colony or which state was which. They were following essentially the exact same pattern. And it was a pattern that is exactly the opposite of the Homeland Security pattern that Congress is imposing. Congress is imposing a bureaucratic, pyramidal, top-down structure where the orders come from the all-seeing eye in Washington and filter their way down through various bureaucracies at the state and local level, eventually coming to the SWAT team on Main Street in Smallville, USA. That's their structure. The constitutional structure is from the bottom up. Why? Because it's based upon popular sovereignty, right? It's based upon we the people. It's organization of the entire population in this body in each state or colony at the time, called the militia. Now, what were the basic principles of the militia? Well, first was universal organization. And just covering this point about the women, they had a system of fines. If you didn't comply with militia regulations, you were fined. That was the first step. Then other things followed. If you couldn't pay or wouldn't pay. But initially it was fines. And the second principle of militia, beyond universal applicability, was everyone had to be armed. Because these were quasi-military organizations. Their major problem was insurrection, slavery, or Indians close by, or invasion from hostile Indians or the French, or perhaps to some extent the Spanish or pirates, and they had a lot of piracy going on at that time. So they were quasi-military organizations, and everyone was required to have a firearm. And how was he supposed to get this firearm? Go into the market and buy it. Within so many days, your 16th birthday or so many days of your residence in this colony, you have to provide yourself with a firearm, and typically that was purchased. If you were too poor to buy one, they'd get you a job, or if you were a farmer, they'd sell your produce. There were different methods for raising money for the individual. And if you were really too poor, if you were unemployable, then the town, through taxes, or the militia, through its fines, would buy a firearm and give it to you. And that included as well ammunition. And they might, in some instances, require you to have a bayonet or a tomahawk or a saber, depending on whether you're the cavalry or the infantryman. There's a whole list of equipment, accoutrements as they call them. And these were to be kept in your personal possession at home, to be used whenever you might be called out for militia service. So their form of gun control was a bottom-up gun control. Everybody had a gun. All right? So if you look at the Second Amendment, just to make a quick aside here, all those people who talk about the Second Amendment as protecting an individual right have it exactly upside down. The Second Amendment is based on an individual duty to have a gun, because it's tied to this concept of the militia. All right? You read that amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the free state. Stop right there. What's the purpose of that amendment? It's the free state. All right? If we could do it without the right to keep and bear arms, we'd still want the free state. How do we get the free state? By having this thing called a well-regulated militia. What is this right to keep and bear arms? It's something that gives us a well-regulated militia that allows us to have the free state. Simple, right? Wrong. Every gun rights organization in this country comes at it in the opposite direction. So it's really not that simple. Maybe they did need to go to Harvard after all. But I don't think so. But in any event, gun control in those days was from the bottom up. Everyone had to have a gun. If you didn't have a gun, what happened to you? You were fined. They would send people around on a regular basis, a sergeant or a corporal or a cornet or an ensign or whatever, some lower level officer, and they'd hold what was called a sight, S-I-G-H-T. They'd come to your house, knock on the door, let me see your musket, your ammunition, your tomahawk, whatever. And for each one of those pieces of equipment that you didn't have, there was a specific fine in most of these statutes, so many shillings. And they went up, of course, during periods of warfare. So everyone was required to have this equipment. If he didn't have it, he'd pay a fine. Now, this is how the women fit in. Because most militias ran from 16 to 55 or 60. Massachusetts was 15. And that was based upon ability. By the time you became 15 or 16 years old, you were considered, at least physically and morally, to be an adult. You could be hanged for committing a felony. And by the time you were 55 or 60 years old, you had rheumatism, you had cancer, you had cataracts. Not too many people functioned terribly well by that age. So they took it as a presumption that once you reached that point, we weren't going to require you to become a participant in this. Didn't stop them from becoming participants. I mean, most people here have read about the Lexington and Concord event and how many superannuated men were out there taking a shot at the British. So they could continue to volunteer their services, but they weren't required.